So we're going back 2 weeks ago, picking up Romans 9, just to really quickly review the main themes that we have hit. And this is on and I don't have any of these extra ones from Romans 9. I'm sorry, I just have the new one for Romans 10. But it's the Israel topic. Who is Israel is the question we've been dealing with. And we first have been looking at Romans 9, 1 through 29. So far, what we have discovered, amongst other things, is that in the broadest sense, Israel refers to ethnic descendants of Abraham. We see that in chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. Point 2, Israel has been blessed with God's special presence and calling. That's chapter 9, verses 4 and 5. Number 3 was something surprising that Paul wanted the people of his day to know. Also wanted us to know that not all Israelites, in the above sense, meaning not all ethnic descendants of Abraham, not all of them are part of Israel. And he says that explicitly in verses 6 through 8. He goes further to make the case in verses 8 through 13 that the basis for being a descendant of Abraham is not natural descent, but it is God's election and promise. Point 5, God is not unjust in his electing. When God looked at the natural descendants of Abraham and elected the descendants of some, like Isaac over Ishmael and Jacob over Esau, God was not being unfair in choosing those lines. He reserves the right to determine how mercy comes into the world. That God chooses the vessels through which his grace and his mercy will flow. God has that right because he knows the best course to take to bring mercy to the most people. Point 6. God directs events in a way that he may be proclaimed and that mercy may be shown. That was found in verses 17 and 18. That God will have mercy and God will harden individuals and he'll elect groups of people in such a way that his name is proclaimed and that the most people possible will be saved. And then in point 7, this is the thing that we ended up on last time, that God has prepared vessels of mercy from the midst of rebellious Israel, the vessels of wrath, to be the ones that would carry on the responsibility of sharing God's mercy and grace to the world. So we're going to go back quickly and review chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. If you remember, we looked at the prophet Jeremiah, who used this imagery of a potter and clay. And it talks about, in the Jeremiah prophecy, that God molds the nation, but when that vessel isn't doing what it's supposed to, he reforms it into a vessel that will accomplish what's supposed to be accomplished out of the same lump of clay. So Jeremiah makes the point that it's not like God just says, well, I'm done with Israel, I'm going to pick this group. Out of the same group, out of the same nation, he will reform and renew it into something new to become the vessel that God desires for it to be. Paul taps into that in Romans chapter 9, 19 through 23, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we already have discussed it. But in verse 19, the question, it's a question that's asked, well, if God's the one doing the electing and God's the one that's bringing all of this mercy and grace in his own way, then why does he blame humans when they don't do what he wants them to do, if it's all up to God's choosing? And the point that Paul is about to make is that you don't have a right to talk back to God. Trust God to rule the universe in such a way that will be blessing to the most people. You're not supposed to, as the creation, yell back to the Creator, well, why are you doing things this way? Do you trust God or don't you? And we have to trust that God knows what He's doing. And then he dives into this imagery about the clay worker. So in verse 20, he answers that rhetorical question, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Well, what is molded say to its molder? Why have you made me like this? Why, God, do you choose some instead of others? Remember, the context is not talking about their eternal salvation. It's talking about the role of being a vessel of God's mercy and grace to the rest of the world. So, what right, God, do you have to make me this way and not that way? The point that Paul is making is God chooses how He will bring His mercy and grace into the world. You, being created as you are, don't yell back at the Creator, finding injustice in what He is doing. And then, verse 21, Paul makes the point, has the potter no right over the clay? Well, what's the answer to that question? Does God have right over His creation to do what He will? Of course He does. That's Paul's point. Like, look, let God be God, and you just do your part. He'll do His part, you do your part. Does God, the potter, have no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and the other for dishonorable use? In this context, the one lump, tying into the Jeremiah imagery, Jeremiah 18 imagery, that one lump is the nation of Israel. Okay, we got to understand that one lump. And out of the same lump, there are some that are used for ignoble purposes, dishonorables, what the ESV says, and some for honorable. Out of the same lump, some will be good vessels that carry on God's mercy and grace. And out of that same lump, some will not be good vessels. They will not carry on the purpose that God desires of them. They will not point the world to Jesus. So you have the nation, and out of the nation, some are followers of Jesus, vessels of glory, but many are not. They are vessels of dishonorable use. They're still being used by God, but not the way God intended. Because God's God, right? Pharaoh, did he want to be used by God? No, but was he? Yes. And the point in all this is that to get more people saved, God will use people the way they need to be used to ensure the salvation of the many. And so, the nation as a whole was faithless and rejected Jesus as Messiah, rejected the purpose for which God had made them, that is to be a blessing to the nations. They refused to be vessels of glory, but God will still use them. It won't be the honor and glory that was intended for them, but they will still be used. They're vessels, but of dishonorable use. That'll get unpacked more later. God will use their disobedience to drive Gentiles to salvation. But then there's other Jews that accepted Jesus as their Messiah, and they became the vessels of glory. They're the ones that accept the truth of Jesus, and because of that, they join the Jesus-following movement, and these Israelites become the true representatives of what Israel was intended to be. They become a source of blessing to the world. And so, that being said, out of the same nation, some for dishonorable use, some for glorious use. What if, this is verse 22, what if God, desiring to show His wrath and to make known His power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? So this group over here will receive judgment for rejecting the Messiah. Why is it that God has not, this is in Paul's day, these vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, that is the Jewish nation that rejected Jesus and had Him crucified, why is He putting up with them? Why doesn't He just... Well, Paul says, well, what if God, desiring to show His wrath and make known His power, has patiently endured these vessels of wrath, in verse 23, so that He might make known the riches of His glory for vessels of mercy, which He has prepared beforehand for glory. He has ordained that those that accept the Messiah will receive glory. Those that reject the Messiah will receive wrath. God patiently was waiting to bring this judgment on the nation, because he was trying to show this group how patient and rich his mercy really is. So he allows the two to side by side live. This is a period of history in Paul's day where the Jewish power system was still in place. You still had a temple system that was very much in control of the direction of the nation. That system was about to be completely wiped out. John the Baptist, we talked about John the Baptist language. That word wrath. Okay, that word wrath. God's about to pour his wrath out on the Jewish nationalistic system. Temple, the city, everything's going to be wiped out. John the Baptist, in his preaching, uses this wrath term. The leaders of Israel come to John the Baptist, and he calls them a brood of vipers. Remember that? He said, what are you doing? Who told you, you brood of vipers, to flee from the coming wrath? Because God's about to pour his wrath out on the disobedient nation that has rejected its God and the Messiah that he has sent. But God is patiently enduring this rebellious group for the sake of those that he has prepared beforehand. Remember, this is not an individualistic predestination. It's the group, those that have been set aside and preordained to be vessels of glory. That's those in the Messiah. A Jewish person can choose to be a vessel of glory or to be a vessel of dishonor. It's up to them to choose which side of the fence will you be on. But this group right here, in order for God to demonstrate his mercy towards them, has patiently endured this group here because he knows there's still some in this group here that will flee the wrath and come into this group. So for the sake of those that will hear the call of their God, he patiently endures the vessels of wrath because he knows out of this group some will actually flee based on the preaching of the gospel and become vessels of glory. He's going to use another image later about an olive tree. This is just using different imagery. Okay? So here's what we see is this tension during the time of the apostles where the nation's in place, the one lump. But out of the one lump, there's the vessels of glory. That's those that accept the Messiah. God's intent for Israel. But then there's group over here, this group that rejects God's purpose for Israel. Why does God allow this power system to stay in place? For the sake of those that he knows will leave and come over to become glory. So there's this vessels of glory. So there's this period of history where God is patiently enduring the power system for the sake of those that he knows will leave and become saved. That lasted for about 40 years, 37 years. When Jesus ascends into heaven, pours out the Holy Spirit, this renewal of Israel begins to take place. And those that accept the Messiah, Jesus is reconstituting Israel around himself. And those that have rejected the Messiah, we see in the book of Acts that they pose themselves as the greatest enemy of the Jesus movement. The elite Jewish power system. And if you read Acts, they are the main persecutors of the Jesus movement early on. Greatest example, remember Stephen? It was the Jewish leadership, not every single Jew. We've got to be careful to designate a difference there. This isn't talking about everybody just because they were Jewish was against Jesus. It's the power system, the national structure who rejected Jesus. They were the ones that spearheaded the persecution of Jesus' followers. They orchestrated for Stephen to be killed. Paul was given, when he was called Saul, a certificate from the leadership to hunt down Christians and have them arrested. This power system was so widespread, it was beyond Jerusalem. In other cities, when Paul would go into a synagogue, that power structure was present there, and these Jewish authorities would run Paul out of town. They'd have him stoned. He would go to synagogues first to call out to the Jews there about Jesus. Like, look, don't be a vessel for dishonorable use prepared for wrath. Become a vessel of glory. And that's why the gospel was preached to Jews first, to give them an opportunity to leave and to flee the coming wrath. And we got to see that context of the New Testament, that the nation is being reformed and renewed, that the power system is being taken place. And I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about this patient endurance. God, for a period, endured this corrupt power structure to stay in place for the sake of those that he knew were going to leave it and enter into his ordained power structure. So I really hate to erase Creighton's awesome thing here. Did y'all write this down?
Yes.
Take a picture of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's on Facebook.
It's on Facebook, but I'm going to have to. I'm sorry. And this will help us understand our big question. Who is Israel? And in the New Testament era, there's this kind of simultaneous thing going on. We've already learned through Paul's argument so far that Israel was never exclusively based on hereditary descent from Abraham. It was always rooted in God's election, His calling and purpose. Jesus is the elect one. Jesus is the one that God demonstrates His calling and His purpose through. That's what Paul's argument has been so far. But God is patiently enduring. So there's the one lump, and this is Israel in the broad sense. The nation of Israel. Okay? And out of the same lump, there are the vessels of glory, and we're going to make a crown. And Jesus is the king. Jesus is also the priest and the prophet. Israel was always under leadership. It was a theocracy, right? God was the ruler of Israel. Then they asked for a king. God gave him a king after the pattern of David. Moses, who was their leader, said a prophet like him was coming later. There was a priesthood that was ordained and established by God. Jesus, being fully God and fully man, brings all that into one. It's a theocracy. Is God the ruler of the church? Yeah, Jesus, the God-man, is the king and the prophet and the priest. So these are the vessels of glory. This is where Israel is supposed to be, under the authority of the prophet, priest, king, who is the God-man present with them, that will accomplish God's purpose through Israel. Through Israel, all nations now will be blessed. Is this making sense? But then you had some of the Israelites, and in fact, the power structure, we're going to make a temple-looking thing. The temple structure. This is, we'll just call it the powers. Israelite powers. This is the priesthood. This is the authority. They're Jewish, but they are dead set against the Jesus movement because they're losing authority and they're losing power. God has announced judgment upon the nation. All of those that do not reform and enter into God's elected pattern for Israel, that is through the Messiah, they will be destroyed with the powers that have rejected the Messiah. Because these over here, they are pretenders to power. They have no authority. The priesthood has changed hands. They have no authority because the true king is Jesus enthroned at the right hand of God. They have no authority because Jesus, the prophet, fulfills all of the prophecies. You know all the debates they had with Jesus about how to interpret the Bible, and he shamed them every time? They were incompetent to interpret the Scriptures, lacked the power of a God-ordained king. They had a priesthood that had been utterly rejected by God, and God's presence had left them. In Ezekiel, you see a vision of the Spirit of God, the presence of God leaving the temple in Jerusalem. God's presence was not with him. And Jesus demonstrates this fact when he goes into the temple. Remember that? Jesus goes into the temple right before his death, and what does he do? Flips over tables, drives people out. He announces a judgment on it. He said, my Father's house is to be a house of prayer for the nations. You're supposed to be a blessing to all nations.
Not a den of thieves.
But you've made it a den of thieves. And Jesus rejects the temple. And then, remember, he cursed a fig tree, which was representative. It was a symbol of the nation of Israel. It looked fruitful, beautiful leaves, but it bore no fruit. So he cursed it, and it died. Then he goes up on the temple, on the top of the Mount of Olives, and looks down at the temple. His disciples are like, look at these wonderful stones and structures and how awesome and powerful the temple is. And then what does Jesus say? He says, I tell you the truth, there will be a day when not one stone is left upon the other. And then he gives a prophecy that ties in the destruction of Israel and the temple with the end of the world. It's like this interplay of two things. Jesus prophesies in the sermon that this power structure will be completely done away with in a day of wrath. And God patiently endures this group, even though they're killing his people. They killed Jesus. They killed Stephen. They were arresting Christians. A great persecution broke out. They are going after this true Israel with all that they got. Why doesn't God just deal with it? Well, Paul says he's patiently enduring the vessels of wrath to demonstrate his mercy to this group, because he knows that there are some that they see what's going on and they belong here, but they're just here, and he's giving them time to run over here. Does that make sense? So he's patiently enduring the vessels prepared for wrath. When does this happen, by the way? A little bit outside, but we'll get here eventually when we talk about Jesus' sermon. We actually have a point in history. The New Testament prophesies it's going to happen, but the whole New Testament was written, or at least most of the New Testament was written before this historical event happened. When did God bring this judgment, wiping out the powers? Does anybody know? AD 70? When Titus, the Roman general, came and completely wiped out Jerusalem, wiped out the temple. Everything was carted away. It's done. This temple is completely rejected, cut off. That Jerusalem was cut off and rejected. And we'll talk more about this later. But followers of Jesus then pick up language like, this temple is condemned. There's a new temple with a real priest and a real king. What's that temple? Jesus and us being built into a temple of spiritual stones. Then Paul makes this distinction. Likewise, the book of Hebrews taps into it, that there's this Jerusalem below, but that's not really Jerusalem. Where's the real Jerusalem? In heaven. The heavenly Jerusalem that at the end will descend. Now, so here's why this matters. And I've been building the case for this. The rejection of this, are they Jews ethnically? Do they claim to be Israel?
Yes.
Do they have a temple? Do they have priests? Do they have a government? But is it really Israel? Who's really Israel? Jesus. Is he Jewish? His earlier followers, were they Jewish? Who is the true Israel that God has said, this is Israel, this is my people, this is the true Israel? This was cut off and rejected. And here's the thing. The purpose for Israel, remember the blessing given to Abraham, was always that through him all families of earth would be blessed. The goal was always for the inclusion of the blessing to be so far-reaching that non-Jews were brought into it, so that people who weren't even ethnically Jewish could become Jewish. That was always the goal. This group wasn't having any of that. They were rejecting God's purpose for themselves. This group, joining in the Jesus movement, realized that Jesus came to bless the nation, first the Jew, but through blessing the nation, healed them to help them to be successful in doing what God wanted them to do to begin with. Reaching the nations and bringing them in. And that's the next thing that Paul's going to talk about here. So let's go ahead and going back to verse 24. Paul makes this transition after he unpacks it. He patiently was waiting to judge this group. for the sake of this group, because, he's giving time for those that he knows are going to come over here to do so. And then it says that he has prepared this group beforehand for glory, even us whom he has called. So he's saying all of us that have heard the call to come out of this system, because was Paul in this system at one time? Yes, he was. He heard the call, and the Lord brought him to his knees. And he came kicking and screaming, but when he beheld the resurrected Jesus, he was like, whoa, I received the calling and I came. So it said, even those of us whom he has called, not from the Jews only. This was the thing that was like, he's been building this case all along, that God's election was always what constituted Israel. This is where he really flips the table on them, and these Jewish Christians were like, whoa. He says, not from the Jews only, but also, what does it say? From the Gentiles. And then he quotes Hosea the prophet in 25. Indeed, he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people. And her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. Now remember, the love-hate isn't our petty liking something better than something else. It's strictly speaking in terms of blessing or cursing, working for or striving against. God had elected Israel to work for and through Israel. The other nations were to be blessed by Israel. But now what he's saying is these nations that had not been chosen for that purpose are now going to be brought in. They're going to be brought in to also be beloved of God. They will receive the same calling and blessing that Israel does. And then in verse 25 it says, in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. Children of God. Remember, he starts off the argument about who the descendants are. He said, not all those descended from Abraham, but not all those descended from Israel are true Israel. It's all about God's election. And then at the bottom end of it, he says, there's going to be some that aren't even Jewish that will be called descendants of Abraham. That's huge. And so helping us understand what's going on in Paul's argument here is this whole thing going on. This is the Israel that God elects. Is Israel extant today? Is Israel alive and well and thriving today? Yes. But where is the Israel that God has ordained and elected to be Israel? We're in it. Yeah. It's us. Because we have accepted the Jewish prophet, priest, king, God, who's ruling over us. We have accepted the blessing. Realize, Paul's going to talk about this. We receive salvation only through Israel. Jesus is Jewish, and he constituted a new Israel around himself. 12 apostles, reflecting the 12 tribes of Israel, doing what Israel was meant to do, blessing the nations. We have received the benefit of faithful Israel accomplishing what God called Israel to do. And now you and I are verses 25 and 26. Isn't that awesome? You're like, oh man, you read about David and you read about Abraham and you read about Isaiah and you see this wonderful rich history and you feel like an outsider. Wouldn't it be cool to be Jewish and to not read it as an outsider? And because that was the experience of Greek proselytes. They weren't Jewish. They accepted who God was. They go to temple. They worship in the temple, but they had to stay on the other side of what was called the court of the Gentiles. They couldn't draw close to God in the sense that a Jewish man could. But through Jesus, now we not only get to draw near to God, we get to be his children. And we can truly say, remember the kid song, Father Abraham had many sons, I am one of them, and so are you. That is a true song. It's a true story. Because Israel is the Israel that God elects. Is this making sense? Yeah. All right. So, going ahead to finish out this chapter, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel. The whole nation, okay, calls out. Though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, big nation, right? Only a remnant of them will be saved. So there's this huge number. But out of that huge number, only a remnant. Well, in this, who is the remnant that is saved? This is the Jewish remnant. Are they Jewish? Absolutely. This is Israel. We can never lose sight of that. Thoroughly Jewish. And that's why I keep saying that, because there's a relevance there in how we understand the Bible and our very faith. And I think that Christians, especially in America, for a long time have lost sight of our Jewish roots for our faith and have interpreted the Bible in a non-Jewish way to our detriment. Well, I don't think we've understood the Bible in its fullest because we haven't grasped this, that we've been blessed through Israel, the faithful Israel through Jesus. And so we'll come back and talk about that later. But he says, only a remnant will be saved. Verse 28, the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth and without delay. As Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, had not left us seed, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. If God had not made a way for there to be a remnant through Jesus, the whole nation would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. How did that work out? Not good. The cities were destroyed, and was there a remnant? Lot, only because of association with Abraham, because of his connection with Abraham. But from the city itself, there was no remnant. Everything wiped out completely. But the Lord left seed. Who is, remember we talked about this, who is the seed of Abraham, through whom the blessing comes? It's Jesus. So God says, okay, y'all are not doing this. You're not doing it right. You're messing it up, but that's okay. I'll do for you what you cannot do. And he sends Jesus, the faithful remnant, who then gathers Israelites around himself. Israelites who recognize their God when he shows up. That's why when the voice of the shepherd calls, he said, my sheep know me, they know my name. Those Israelites that were dedicated to God and not to power and self-promotion, when their God showed up, they recognized his voice. And they came and they followed him. They were the remnant. They really knew God. The Father ensured that those who knew him would hear Jesus and would be drawn to him to be saved. But those that never knew God, when Jesus showed up, though he came to his own, they knew him not. Remember in John 1? Their own Messiah, their own God showed up and they didn't even recognize him because their hearts were far from God. God made a way through Jesus, left them a remnant. In verse 30, we're only going through 29, I'm sorry. But let's go ahead and do 30. I don't have it on a sheet. I didn't realize I didn't have it on a sheet, but we'll finish out this chapter. What shall we say then? He's starting to sum up his argument, at least this section of the argument. That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness, that means they did not have the Torah, the Old Testament, and they weren't trying to live by it. So they didn't pursue that, but they've attained righteousness. They've been made right with God. That is a righteousness that is by faith. Their connection with God is not through covenant Torah keeping, it's through Jesus. And then he goes on and he says, but that Israel who pursued the law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching that law. They did not understand what the purpose of the law was for. And so, because of that, the law for them was not the source of blessing that God intended. That's what it says in verse 32. Why? Why was it that even though they had the law, were trying to do what it said, that it did not lead them to Jesus? Because they did not pursue it by faith. They made it just a list of rules. That's right. They made it a list of If we do these things, God has to bless us, and we can use these rules and regulations to stay in power.
And they had faith that that would work.
It wasn't
But they
faith in
didn't have
Jesus.
Jesus.
That's right. That's right. And so those that did pursue God through the Torah with faith, guess where they ended up? With Jesus, because they recognized the object of their faith. It says, they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They've stumbled over the stumbling stone. As it is written, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Who is the stumbling stone and the rock of offense? It's Jesus.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought the wrong way. Sorry.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's the thing about it. Yeah, our brain first goes to, well, the stone of offense. It's always got to be a bad thing. It's not. It's their faith-based or lack of faith in their works-based system was so far removed from what God wanted that when Jesus shows up, they trip over him instead of embracing him as the Messiah. And he is the stone of offense. Are they offended by Jesus? Oh yeah, for multiple reasons, right? But if you trust in him, if you put faith in him, you will not be put to shame. He will deliver, right? And here's what we have going on here. Here's why I wanted to unpack this, because we're about to get into chapter 10 soon. This is going to talk about, it's going to keep building on this idea that Jesus is the way that someone is saved. Jesus is the condition for being in the group that is rescued. And that offering is made to Jews and to Gentiles. But it's extended to Jews first because they have to realize they can't rely on their Judaism, on their ethnicity. I'm a descendant of Abraham. They can't depend on the temple system. God's rejected it. They can't depend on military exploits and putting their own king up because God's already appointed a king. They can't depend on their Torah keeping because they're missing the whole point of the Torah. It wasn't about them trying to check yes and no to certain boxes. It was to have their heart pointed to the God that gave the law. They were missing the whole point of it. And so, Paul's building this argument that Israel needs salvation through Jesus. Don't depend on this old system that will not save you. So, our relevance, we got 5 minutes. Our relevance, we're talking about eschatology. There's so many points that could be made, but I want to make 2. There's a lot of talk in pop culture, Christianity, preachers, books, radio, movies even, about Israel's role in the end times. And every time something happens over in modern day geopolitical Israel, people are like, oh, and they make charts and they sell books, and it's this big deal, right? And I've presented the case all along that geopolitical nation over there, whatever we politically feel is the wisest course of action for, I'm talking strictly biblically from a theological standpoint, the Israel that sits in Palestine off the coast of the Mediterranean really has nothing to do with God's election for bringing blessing into the world.
So that isn't the Israel that's over here.
This is the church.
Yeah, but the
Jew
one
and
that's
Gentile
over
alike.
there that you're talking about.
And this is a different, somewhat different, because this group, this has been
Done away.
done away with. The modern political entity, they don't claim to be a theocracy. It's a whole different thing, okay? We got to understand that. They are Jewish by ethnicity, most of them, but there's a huge group that's not even Jewish. They're Arab or something else. My point is calling something Israel doesn't mean it's this. Does that make sense? The nation state, modern nation state of Israel, whatever we think or don't think about it in a political concept, it's not a theocracy. They have no divinely appointed king. They have no divinely appointed temple or priests. They have no divinely appointed prophet. It's a whole different entity. In the Old Testament, for Israel to be Israel, they had to have all of those elements. If they rejected God as their king, God was like, I'm selecting a remnant that loves me, but then he carted the rest of the nation off into exile. He rejected the nation. If they rejected his divinely appointed king, he brought judgment on them. They would be cut off from the people. If you did not listen to the Lord's prophets, you got cut off from the people. If you refused to go to the established temple and priesthood, you got cut off from the people. And to be cut off means, guess what you don't belong to anymore? The nation of Israel. And so what has happened is a lot of Christians, when they hear Israel, their brain says, oh, this is the same Israel that we read about in Genesis through Malachi and that we read about in the Gospels. What I'm proposing is that based on everything we've seen, it's not the same Israel. Because it's not a theocracy, no prophet, no priest, no king. That's always what made Israel Israel. Paul himself said, not everyone descended from Abraham is Israel. It's only those that God has elected. And he's elected those that have accepted Jesus in his rule as prophet, priest, and king, accepted that he is God with his people. And so the thing is we have to understand that although we must pray for that nation of Israel, and we must evangelize that nation of Israel, we have to let the Bible speak on its own terms and not jump to conclusions that everything that nation does must be what God wants it to do. Some have gone so far as to say that we must support that nation state no matter what happens, because God says pray for Israel and support Israel. He does. But which is the Israel that God has ordained and elected as Israel? Israel under the Messiah. So when we read in the Psalms, pray for Israel, we still pray for Israel, but the application for today is pray for the kingdom, the church. Pray for God's people everywhere. Does that mean that we just say, well, forget about that state of Israel? No, we pray for them too. And we love them deeply, and we are motivated to share the love of Jesus with them. And we'll talk about that in chapter 10 more. But that's part A. I would encourage you, and I'm not saying you have to agree with me. Like I said, I'm presenting a position that I believe best represents the biblical material. But I wanted to put this out there because I believe it's wise. Anytime you hear a preacher or see a preacher throw maps up with Israel and this and this and this fulfilling prophecies, put up your radar of, what's this guy or lady talking about? Because almost always there's a jump that's made that modern day Israel equals Old Testament Israel, which that's not biblically the case. I really don't believe so based on the things that we have seen. So that being so, it kind of keeps us from being fleeced by some. I saw a guy on TV selling vials of water from the Jordan River blessed by a rabbi, like $50. And if you do that, it supports the temple rebuilding project and you'll get blessed because you prayed for Israel. All due respect, I think that guy's either misled or a charlatan. There's nothing about that water that does anything for anyone. They can build back any temple they want and it's not going to do anything. Because blood sacrifice from an animal will never ever take away the sins of people. Jesus, the priest, has instituted his own temple, that is us. And so I think this is helpful to make this distinction because it guards against some of the more sensational approaches of the Bible, especially the way some people approach the book of Revelation. That's part one. Part two, I think this is really important for us to understand. And this is the more brief thing. Remember the purpose for Israel was to be a source of blessing for the nations. Jesus, the representative of Israel, did that. His followers, they did that. So what is our purpose? As those that have received the blessing through Israel, through Jesus and his followers, we've been brought into this family. Guess what our calling and purpose is to be? To be a source of blessing to all the families of the earth. Vessels of glory to go into all the world and make sure they know that Jesus is the Lord and the King for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike. That is our calling. We have inherited the blessing and the calling of Abraham. Not because of anything we did, not because we're Jewish by nature, but 100%, though we are unnatural branches, through Jesus, we've been plugged into the tree of the Israel of God. So why are we here? We are God's Israel on earth, blessing the nations through the ministry of our prophet, priest, and king. That's why we're here. Sharing the good news that Jesus is king, Jesus is priest, Jesus is prophet. God has come and he's made a way for us to receive the blessings, not of this, but of the heavenly Jerusalem that is above, that will one day come and usher in an eternity of glory with the God who made us. Does that make sense? That's our calling and that's our purpose. So that's it. 5 minutes after, we started 5 minutes late, so I think we're good.
Can I ask you a question?
You absolutely can.
Sunday is Pentecost.
Yes.
All right. And it said in the calendar, it said Pentecost celebration 6:30 in the sanctuary.
That is not right.
Okay.
6:30 at the picnic shelter. Just come down
It's gonna
here.
be at the picnic shelter.
Yeah, we're going to use that and open up that door so that people, if you need to get inside, you can sit either in that classroom or this one. So if you need AC or the bathroom, but we'll use the picnic shelter in these couple of rooms.
Okay.
So 6:30, picnic shelter, at least come in this side of the building. Remember, if you have it, wear something of a fiery color, red, orange, yellow. There is a point for that.
Is that morning and evening or just evening?
So that's wearing, you wear what you want, but the wearing the fiery clothes ties in with Sunday morning. Then Sunday night is the picnic thing, and you can still wear that if you
We're
want.
still doing a dish, right?
Yeah, a side or a dessert,
Okay.
and then meats and drinks will be furnished. There's other people preparing meats, but yeah, I think it'll be good. I wish that I had time to unpack what Pentecost has to do with all this, but we don't have time to talk about it. It's really amazing. But this whole concept, the day of Pentecost, kicks it off, where you have, I don't have time to talk about it. All right.
Did you condense this?
In short, the nation that had been scattered to the winds because of their rebellion against God, right? They're in exile, they're pushed everywhere. Well, on the day of Pentecost, guess where they were at? Jerusalem. They had come. Jews and proselytes. So Jews that had lived in other places and Gentiles that became Jewish worshipers of God were right there. And then comes the descent of the Spirit on the true temple of God. Remember, both the tabernacle and the temple, fire comes and consumes the sacrifice. Well, God comes and tongues of fire rest on his elected temple. Then representatives of this temple, Jesus' followers, share, hey, the times of refreshing are coming. Repent, turn to God. Y'all killed Jesus, but you better come over here. You better do something about it. And they want to know what to do. Repent, be baptized. You'll receive the Holy Spirit too. We see this great reversal of where the nation, because rebellion had been scattered, has now been harvested. And the true Israel begins to take root and seed on the day of Pentecost. Most of the believers that were baptized that day were Jewish. This is the new Israel on Acts 2. The new Israel has begun. It has been proven that Jesus ascended to the throne. That's why Jesus pours out the Spirit. It has been proven that Jesus is the prophet. Peter talks about that. Like Jesus, he preached the truth. It has been proven that Jesus is the priest that has poured out the Holy Spirit to sanctify his people. So this era has begun. The Spirit has poured out. And no longer do people have to come to a central place of worship to experience God's presence. Now God's presence is with his people, the true Israel. And when they go back home, God's presence goes with them. So it's a reversal. It's the launching of the new Israel that God has ordained and established, filled with his holy presence. Because what made Israel was God's presence in the Holy of Holies. That's what set them apart. That presence left in Ezekiel. You see it riding out the door. But then the Spirit comes and fills the followers of Jesus. God's Holy of Holies isn't a box in a room. It's us, wherever we go. And so, I mean, there's a ton more that could be said about that. But that's the awesome thing of Pentecost, this great reversal. This is when God kicks it off. And the nation is renewed and reestablished in Jesus the Messiah.